Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. On December 7th, 1996, Robert Ramirez was shot in the back by Officer Waldman at a distance of 3 feet. He was admitted to the hospital that same morning, where it was determined that the bullet entered just above Mr. Ramirez's right shoulder, traversed downward, punctured his right lung, and embedded itself in the pericardium of his heart. As a result, Mr. Ramirez lost over 2,000 cc's of blood. That's roughly 2/5 of the entire amount of blood that a human being has in their body. On January 10th, over a month later, after Mr. Ramirez had finally become stable enough to operate on, the doctors at the hospital performed surgery to remove the bullet from the lining of his heart. And it was still over 2 weeks later before Mr. Ramirez was discharged from the hospital. These facts are undisputed. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the use of excessive force and a tale of lies by 2 officers to cover up the use of that excessive force. The issue before you today as a jury is to answer the following question. Did Mr. Waldman act reasonably under the circumstances? And if you find that Mr. Waldman did not act reasonably under the circumstances, there's an additional question that you must answer. Did Mr. Waldman act within the course and scope of his employment? After closing arguments today, the judge will issue a set of jury instructions to you. And part of these instructions will be what is the basis of evidence that you need to make your decision on. The basis that you will be deciding on this afternoon as to whether Mr. Waldman acted reasonably or not is the preponderance of evidence standard. Some of you may be familiar with the beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's not what we're here to talk about today. Beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard of evidence that you would use in a criminal case, whether the defendant was guilty or not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So what exactly does preponderance of evidence means? Preponderance of evidence means that if Mr. Ramirez is telling the truth by a margin of 51% or more, then you should find in favor of Mr. Ramirez. If Mr. Ramirez is not telling the truth by at least 51%, then you should find in favor of Mr. Waldman. Basically, some of the facts and evidence that you've heard throughout the case was that Officer Levy testified that as Mr. Ramirez was leaving the car, that he was yelling something in Spanish. However, you've heard testimony from both Mr. Ramirez and his late wife, Maria, that Mr. Ramirez never has spoken Spanish, does not know the Spanish language, and doesn't know Spanish at all. You've also heard testimony from both officers that Mr. Ramirez attacked Officer Levy with a knife in his right hand. However, you heard testimony by both Mr. Ramirez and his late wife that Mr. Ramirez is not right-handed, but he is left-handed. Then there's the knife. Mr. Ramirez testified that he does own a utility knife, which he uses in his line of work as a carpenter, and he does own a scaling knife, which he uses to scale fish, but at no time has he ever owned a jackknife. And this was confirmed by testimony again by Mr. Ramirez's late wife, Maria. So the question is, where did the knife come from? Also, during the altercation, you heard Officer Waldman testify that Officer Levy had a tight grip on the forearm, the right forearm of Mr. Ramirez, but Officer Levy had lost that grip. He could no longer hang on, and that Mr. Ramirez was raising the knife again to strike Officer Levy. And contrary to that testimony, was the direct testimony of Officer Levy, who said he had a very sure grip on the right arm of Mr. Ramirez. So tight, in fact, that he said it may have been the best grip he had ever had. So now, how do you reconcile those two differences? One officer said he lost the grip, the other said he had the best grip perhaps he'd ever had in his life. And still there are other questions that remain unanswered, specifically from the incident report, which was filed by Officer Wayland after the two officers had left the scene and gone to the hospital. Number one is the position of the cars. Both officers testified that Mr. Ramirez had pulled in at an angle to the police vehicle, thus cutting off their means of travel or their exit. Yet the incident report was contrary to that testimony. The incident report said the two cars were parked in a parallel fashion and that either car could have exited without the other car blocking its way. The incident report also reported that the knife was found in the closed position while laying on the ground. So that raises the question, how does a jackknife that locks in the open position wind up in a closed position on the ground? Another unanswered question. Next, there is fingerprints, or better stated, the absence of fingerprints on the knife. Again, the incident report said there was no visible fingerprints on the knife. How can Mr. Ramirez have gripped the knife so tightly as to stab Officer Levy and leave no fingerprints on the knife? Another unanswered question. And then there's the issue of the blood. If Officer Levy was indeed stabbed with a knife, why wasn't there any blood found on the knife, which the incident report said there was not? 4 questions from the incident report in direct contradiction to the testimony of the two officers. Again, this case is about the use of excessive force by a police officer and a tale of lies woven together to come up with some reasonable explanation as to what happened. And as you can see by the amount of unanswered questions, there are gaping holes in the officer's testimony. As you dismiss to the jury room with all these unanswered questions, I would ask that you find in favor of Mr. Ramirez and give him the compensation he is due for the use of excessive force by these two police officers. And one final thought as you dismiss. Remember, Mr. Ramirez was shot in the back from a distance of about 3 feet, something that you or I or the average person could cover in a single step.